Ibrahim Traoré sat in a dimly lit war room, his eyes fixed on a set of satellite images that seemed too extraordinary to believe. At first glance, the terrain beneath the Sudan-Chad border appeared barren, nothing more than desert scars left by centuries of shifting sands. Yet as the algorithms traced the mineral density, his hands began to tremble. Hidden beneath the ancient rock formations lay a deposit of gold so vast it exceeded all that mankind had mined in recorded history. But it was not merely the scale of the treasure that unsettled him. It was the knowledge that foreign powers already circled like vultures. The very wealth that could transform Africa into a continent of prosperity could also ignite the bloodiest resource war ever fought. And then came the knock at his door, a geologist from Sudan carrying documents that would either unite Africa or condemn it to another century of exploitation. Stay close. This is not just about gold. It is about the destiny of a continent. Subscribe and stand with us because Africa's story must be told by Africans themselves. What Ibrahim was about to learn would not only test his courage, but rewrite the meaning of independence itself. The night was heavy with silence when Dr. Fatima al-Rashid crossed the barren expanse that separates Sudan from Burkina Faso. She carried no banner of office, no security convoy, only a weathered briefcase clutched close to her chest. Inside were documents so sensitive that they could alter the fate of nations. Geological surveys, seismic readings, and hand-drawn maps that her family had guarded for nearly a century. Every step she took across that desert was pursued by shadows, agents of foreign mining companies who had already tried to silence her with bribes and threats. When at last she reached Ibrahim Traoré's secure compound in Ouagadougou, she was exhausted but unbroken. The guards hesitated before letting her in, but the young geologist demanded an audience with the president. Moments later, she stood before him, her hands trembling as she placed the briefcase on the table. "Mr. President," she whispered, "what I am about to show you can either free Africa or destroy it forever." With deliberate care, she revealed the data. Vast sheets of seismic readings, chemical analyses, and most astonishing of all, a detailed mineral map of the Sahel. According to her research, the Nuba Mountains of Sudan concealed a gold deposit so immense that conservative estimates suggested 50,000 tons of recoverable metal. At current values, this was more than the total supply mined in the last 100 years combined. Traoré, trained as a soldier and now burdened with the mantle of leadership, leaned forward in silence as he calculated what such numbers meant. If the figures were true, they could elevate Africa to unprecedented wealth, or plunge it into chaos as rival powers fought for control. Fatima's evidence did not end there. She had traced the geological formation beyond Sudan's borders into Chad, the Central African Republic, and even the northern reaches of Burkina Faso itself. What she described was not a single deposit, but an underground reef stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers across the Sahel, laid down by hydrothermal forces more than 2 billion years ago. Conservative estimates placed the total reserves at 100,000 tons, a treasure valued in trillions of dollars. Traoré felt the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. The story of this discovery, however, was older than either of them. Fatima's great-grandfather, Ahmed al-Rashid, had once guided a British colonial geologist, Sir Henry Peyton, through the mountains in 1923. Peyton's classified reports, locked away in London archives for nearly a century, described anomalous mineral concentrations of unprecedented scale. Ahmed had secretly copied his maps and hidden them in his family's ancestral cave. For 4 generations, the al-Rashid family had passed down whispers of the cursed gold that could either save Sudan or damn it. Fatima had dismissed these tales as folklore until her scientific instruments confirmed their truth. Now she stood before Ibrahim, offering him proof that her ancestors had guarded something real. But history had a cruel sense of irony. While the al-Rashid family had waited patiently for a moment of strength, foreign powers had already begun to circle. Fatima recounted how 6 months earlier she had been approached by representatives of 3 different mining conglomerates, each claiming exclusive knowledge of the deposit. They had offered her $50 million to remain silent. When she refused, she realized her life was in danger. What she did not yet know was that her discovery had already reached the ears of global intelligence agencies. In Tel Aviv, satellites originally built for military reconnaissance had detected unusual signatures beneath the Nuba Mountains. Israeli officials had begun quiet negotiations with Sudanese generals, offering money, weapons, and infrastructure in exchange for mining rights. In Moscow, the Wagner Group had established outposts disguised as security consultancies, while Russian geologists confirmed the presence of extraordinary reserves. Beijing's approach was subtler but no less determined. Chinese engineers drilling water wells across the Sahel had in fact been mapping a mineral corridor that stretched from Sudan to Mali. Each nation believed itself clever, each certain that it alone had discovered the secret. In truth, they were racing toward the same prize, unaware of each other's presence. Ibrahim absorbed all this in silence, his soldier's mind turning over the implications. If he revealed the discovery, foreign powers would descend like wolves. If he concealed it, Africa might lose its chance to claim sovereignty over its own wealth. Fatima looked at him with weary eyes. "Mr. President," she said, "the world will come for this gold. The only question is whether we face them divided or united." The room was thick with silence. Ibrahim's gaze returned to the satellite images that had first shaken him. In them, he saw not only the shimmer of gold, but the reflection of Africa's long struggle, centuries of exploitation, debt, and hunger amid riches buried under its own soil. At last, he closed the briefcase and locked it with a steady hand. "Then we must prepare," he said quietly, "because what you have shown me is not just a discovery. It is a battlefield, and outside the compound walls, intelligence operatives from at least 5 nations were already watching, convinced they alone held the secret of the Sahel. They were wrong, fatally wrong." In the weeks that followed Fatima al-Rashid's revelation, the atmosphere in Ouagadougou grew tense. President Ibrahim Traoré summoned trusted allies to a clandestine meeting. Under the cover of night, convoys slipped across borders carrying the presidents of Chad, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan. They gathered not in palaces, but in an underground chamber beneath Burkina Faso's presidential residence, away from the prying eyes of foreign satellites. On the table lay Fatima's documents. Maps showed the golden corridor stretching across their territories, promising riches that could rebuild roads, hospitals, and schools. But with the promise came peril. President Deby of Chad broke the silence first. "My friend," he said gravely, "what you propose has never been attempted. Joint development across multiple African nations? The logistics alone are staggering. More importantly, the moment we declare our intent, foreign powers will move to destroy us." President Touadéra of the Central African Republic leaned forward, his face etched with worry. "They killed Gaddafi when he tried to unite Africa's resources. The West will not tolerate another challenge to their dominance." President Kiir of South Sudan was even more direct. "Brother Ibrahim, they will come for us with everything they have, money, propaganda, even war." Traoré listened without interruption. His eyes were steady, his voice calm. "They destroyed Gaddafi because he stood alone. But if we act together, if we unite, the cost of attacking us becomes too great. Libya fell in isolation. We will not repeat that mistake." He outlined his vision, a Sahel Gold Consortium, binding their nations together in a collective agreement. No contracts with foreign powers, no secret deals. The gold would be extracted, processed, and sold under African terms, with profits shared among the member states. It was not merely an economic pact, but a declaration of sovereignty, a refusal to remain colonies in all but name. The room was filled with hesitation, but also with a flicker of something long buried: hope. For the first time, these leaders imagined a future where Africa did not beg for aid but commanded respect through its own wealth. Slowly, one by one, they agreed. The consortium was born that night, sealed with handshakes and solemn oaths. But their enemies were already moving. Far to the north, in a dusty town called Fod, located directly above one of the richest concentrations of gold in the Sahel, a convoy of armored vehicles rumbled across the desert. The men inside carried no flags, no insignia. Yet their origins were clear. Satellite images later confirmed what African intelligence already suspected. Wagner mercenaries trained in Russia, Mossad operatives guided by Israeli intelligence, and logistics funded by Chinese mining interests. Three foreign powers, rivals on the world stage, had chosen to cooperate in secret to seize Africa's treasure. Their mission was simple: secure FOD, establish control over the site, and create a fact on the ground that could be leveraged into legal ownership. They expected to face only scattered militias, poorly armed and easily defeated. What they found instead was a revelation. As the convoy entered the town, the streets seemed eerily deserted. Windows shuttered, doors closed, not a civilian in sight. Then came the first crack of rifle fire from a rooftop, followed by the whir of drones circling overhead. Within moments, the mercenaries realized their mistake. Hidden in buildings, concealed among sand dunes, and entrenched in fortified positions were 2,000 soldiers, the newly formed African Resource Defense Force. This was no ragtag militia. These were elite units drawn from Burkina Faso, Chad, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan, trained by officers who had studied at foreign military academies and equipped with modern weaponry acquired through discreet deals. Commanding them was Colonel Amadou Sanogo, a Malian officer whose tactical brilliance had been forged both in African battlefields and in classrooms abroad. For 4 hours, the desert town became a crucible. The mercenaries fought with discipline, but they had been prepared for raiders, not for professional soldiers supported by electronic warfare and live drone intelligence. The Africans cut off their supply lines, jammed their communications, and outflanked their positions. When the smoke cleared, dozens of foreign fighters were captured, their weapons and documents seized as evidence. Most shocking of all, the entire battle was broadcast live. Journalists from African news outlets embedded with the defense force streamed the confrontation in real time. Across the continent, and indeed across the globe, audiences watched as African soldiers fought not against each other but against foreign mercenaries attempting to steal their wealth. The symbolism was undeniable. For generations, Africa had been portrayed as helpless, divided, dependent on outsiders for security and development. Now the world saw something new. African nations standing shoulder to shoulder, defending their resources with unity and resolve. The victory at FOD was more than a military triumph. It was a psychological earthquake. In European capitals, policymakers scrambled to reassess their strategies. In Washington, intelligence analysts reported with alarm that the balance of power in Africa was shifting. And in the streets of Dakar, Nairobi, and Lagos, ordinary Africans celebrated, chanting slogans of unity. But for Ibrahim Traoré, the battle was only the beginning. He knew that defeating a handful of mercenaries was nothing compared to the storm that would come once Africa declared its intentions openly. And so he prepared for the next step, a step that would send shockwaves through the global economy. The morning after the victory at FOD, the Sahel felt different. News spread like wildfire across Africa. Foreign mercenaries had been defeated not by Western troops, not by foreign peacekeepers, but by Africans themselves. Crowds filled the streets of Ouagadougou, Bangui, N'Djamena, and Juba. For once, people were not marching in protest, but in celebration. They waved flags, sang songs of unity, and spoke of a future they had barely dared to imagine. Ibrahim Traoré knew the moment could not be wasted. Within a week, he stood before cameras at a press conference that reached beyond Africa's borders. At his side were President Déby of Chad, President Touadéra of the Central African Republic, and President Kiir of South Sudan. Together, they announced what many had considered impossible: the formal establishment of the Sahel Gold Consortium. "Our nations," Traoré declared, "are bound by blood, by soil, and now by destiny. Beneath our feet lies the greatest treasure humanity has ever known. It will not be stolen. It will not be sold cheaply. It will serve Africa and Africa alone." Dr. Fatima al-Rashid then stepped forward, presenting her geological data to the world. The figures were staggering. Conservative estimates of 50,000 tons of recoverable gold worth trillions of dollars stretching across multiple borders. Gold markets erupted instantly. Prices soared by 40% in a single day. Stocks of major mining corporations collapsed as investors realized that the world's largest untapped reserves would no longer be controlled from London, Paris, or New York. But Ibrahim was not finished. He raised his hand for silence and unveiled the second part of his strategy. "Effective immediately," he announced. "The Sahel Gold Consortium will sell gold only through the African Resource Bank, headquartered in Accra. Sales will be conducted in a new currency, the African Resource Note, backed by gold, oil, and critical minerals." The room erupted in questions. Could such a currency survive against the dollar, the euro, or the yuan? Yet, as Ibrahim explained, the logic was unassailable. Unlike fiat money printed by distant capitals, the African Resource Note would be secured by tangible wealth, metal, fuel, and minerals. To buy African gold, nations would first have to acquire this new currency. The announcement sent shockwaves through the global economy. But within Africa, it ignited something far more powerful, a sense of dignity. For the first time, African nations were setting the rules of trade rather than accepting the terms of others. The impact was immediate. In Burkina Faso, revenues from gold were funneled directly into education. The government founded the Sankara Institute of Technology, a university dedicated to training African engineers, geologists, and scientists. Tuition was free for students from consortium member states, with the aim of keeping Africa's brightest minds at home. In Sudan, profits funded a sweeping transformation of agriculture. Modern irrigation systems turned arid fields into productive farmland. For the first time in living memory, Sudan exported surplus food rather than relying on imports. In Chad, revenue financed the Trans-Sahel Highway, connecting mineral-rich regions to ports in Cameroon and Nigeria. The highway symbolized more than commerce. It marked independence from French-controlled transport networks that had strangled Chad's economy for decades. In the Central African Republic, consortium wealth built Africa's first indigenous diamond cutting and jewelry factories, ensuring that raw stones no longer left the continent only to return as expensive luxury goods. For the first time, value was added within Africa itself. Ordinary citizens felt the change. Hospitals received new equipment. Teachers were paid on time. Roads that had crumbled for decades were finally repaired. The people began to see proof that resource wealth could serve them rather than vanish into foreign bank accounts. Across the continent, whispers grew into chants. New Africa. Africa rise! For the older generation, it was vindication after years of watching their countries exploited. For the young, it was a call to action. Migration patterns began to shift. African students studying abroad no longer dreamed only of staying in Europe or America. They began to speak of returning home to join the movement of building. It was the beginning of a new model of African development, not dictated by the World Bank or IMF, not chained to foreign aid, but born of Africa's own resources and Africa's own choices. But triumph carried with it a shadow. In the embassies of Western capitals, alarm bells rang. Reports poured in of collapsing markets, rising African confidence, and foreign investors losing billions. For policymakers accustomed to dictating Africa's fate, the Sahel Gold Consortium was not a miracle. It was a threat. As Traore's words echoed across the world, secret meetings were already being held in Washington, Paris, and Brussels. Plans were drafted, strategies outlined. Africa's declaration of independence was about to provoke a response more dangerous than any mercenary convoy. If you believe Africa's wealth should serve Africans first, say your word in the comments below. Because what came next would show just how far the West was willing to go to break the dream of African sovereignty. When the leaders of the Sahel Gold Consortium declared their intentions, the shock in Western capitals was immediate. In Washington, the U.S. Treasury Department issued an emergency statement labeling the African Resource Note a weapon of economic terrorism designed to destabilize global markets. Within hours, sanctions were announced against consortium nations. Assets were frozen, trade restrictions imposed, and American officials began lobbying allies to follow suit. In Brussels, European leaders gathered in crisis meetings. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz described the movement as resource nationalism threatening global stability. French officials, humiliated by Chad's decision to bypass French-controlled transport routes, pushed for coordinated sanctions. Across European news outlets, the narrative took shape. African leaders were portrayed as reckless, corrupt, and incapable of managing such immense wealth responsibly. But not every power saw the consortium as a danger. In Moscow, President Vladimir Putin listened as his advisors outlined the collapse of Wagner's influence in Sudan. What could have been a catastrophe was quickly reframed as an opportunity. If we cannot control them, he said, then let us join them. Russia shifted strategy overnight, offering partnership rather than exploitation. It promised military equipment, training, and direct investment in exchange for access under African terms. In Beijing, the response was more pragmatic. At first, Chinese officials feared that African resource independence would undermine years of Belt and Road investments. But Premier Li Qiang saw the potential differently. Reliable suppliers make strong partners, he argued. If Africa insists on sovereignty, then let us respect it. It will give us stability the West cannot match. Within weeks, China became the first major economy to purchase African resource notes, signaling tacit support for the new system. Elsewhere in the global south, the announcement was met with cautious optimism. In New Delhi, Prime Minister Narendra Modi hailed the movement as a sign of a multipolar future. India began discussions to diversify trade into the African currency. In Sao Paulo and Buenos Aires, government spoke of building parallel systems for Latin America's lithium and soy reserves. For once, Africa was not isolated. It was a leader, setting an example that others considered following. Yet for the United States and its European allies, the stakes were existential. If Africa could succeed in selling its resources outside Western control, the foundation of the global financial order, the dominance of the dollar and euro, would begin to crack. They would not let this pass without a fight. Behind closed doors in Davos, a new strategy was born: Operation Reset. It was ruthless in its design. Phase 1, massive disinformation campaigns, portraying African minds as corrupt and environmentally destructive. Phase 2, economic warfare, flooding markets with synthetic gold and short-selling the African currency. Phase 3, covert destabilization, fueling proxy conflicts and ethnic tensions to justify intervention. The West had decided to break Africa's dream before it could spread, and Ibrahim Traoré, aware of their designs through his intelligence chief, Colonel Sankara, prepared for the most dangerous battle yet. Not fought in deserts or towns, but across the fragile systems of global finance and perception. What happened next would decide not only Africa's destiny, but the balance of power in the 21st century. Months after the launch of Operation Reset, it was clear the strategy had failed. Western media campaigns collapsed when independent observers found African minds cleaner and safer than many in Europe. Financial warfare faltered because you cannot short-sell gold when Africa controls the physical supply. Proxy conflicts fizzled as African defense forces responded with unity and precision. Instead of breaking the movement, the pressure hardened it. In Europe and America, the consequences were severe. Factories slowed as the cost of minerals soared. Technology firms struggled to secure cobalt and rare earth elements. Politicians faced growing unrest from industries dependent on cheap African inputs. The global order, built on Africa's exploitation, was cracking. But while the West faltered, a new horizon opened for Africa. Nations that had once been dismissed as developing now looked to the Sahel for leadership. Latin America's lithium triangle, Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, formed their own consortium modeled on Africa's. In the Gulf, oil producers began pricing their exports in currencies backed by resources, not debt. In Southeast Asia, Indonesia, and Malaysia coordinated policies for rare earths and tin. The African spark had ignited a global fire. Within Africa itself, the transformation was undeniable. Universities expanded, funded not by foreign aid but by African gold. Roads linked regions that had long been cut off. Hospitals were modernized. For the first time, ordinary people saw wealth flow from the ground into their communities. The phrase New Africa no longer sounded like a slogan, it became reality. For older Africans, many of whom remembered colonial flags flying above their capitals, the sight was profound. They had endured centuries of humiliation, land seized, minerals stolen, generations impoverished. Now, in their twilight years, they witnessed something their parents had only dreamed of. African leaders refusing to bow, African soldiers defending their soil, African wealth funding African futures. But the path forward remained uncertain. Could Africa maintain unity when the rewards were so great? Could rival clans, ethnic groups, and governments resist the temptation of divide and rule tactics? Could they avoid the trap of repeating the very exploitation they once suffered, this time upon themselves? These were not easy questions. Yet Ibrahim Traoré believed the answer lay in dignity. Our greatest wealth, he told his people, is not the gold in our soil but the unity in our hearts. If we guard that, no empire can defeat us. The choice before Africa was stark: to cling to old divisions and risk collapse, or to embrace collective sovereignty and step into a golden age of independence. And as the world watched with bated breath, Africa stood at the threshold of destiny. Its next step would determine not only its future, but the fate of global power itself. The story of the Sahel Gold was never just about minerals buried beneath the soil. It was about a people deciding that history had taken enough from them. For centuries, Africa had been treated as a warehouse of raw materials, its people reduced to laborers, its governments trapped in debt. But when Ibrahim Traoré locked that briefcase in Ouagadougou and chose unity over silence, a new chapter opened. From the dusty corridors of the Nuba Mountains to the glittering halls of the United Nations, Africa's message grew louder. We will no longer be plundered. We will no longer sell our children's future for pennies. In the eyes of many, this was the true beginning of anti-colonial Africa, not a political slogan, but an economic revolution. Hospitals rose where there had once been ruins. Universities trained engineers who no longer had to flee abroad for opportunity. Roads cut through deserts, linking villages to markets for the first time. And across the continent, young people began to believe that African development was not a foreign gift, but their birthright. For elders who had lived through the bitterness of colonialism, the sight was overwhelming. They had seen promises broken, leaders assassinated, dreams crushed beneath foreign boots. Yet at last they witnessed Africa not begging for respect but demanding it, not as subjects but as equals. Traoré's doctrine was simple: control the wealth, control the destiny. That was the essence of anti-colonial Africa in the 21st century. But this story is not finished. The battles will not end and the temptations of division remain strong. The question now is whether Africa will carry its courage forward or allow old chains to return in new forms. That answer does not belong only to presidents and generals. It belongs to every African who believes that dignity cannot be bought and sovereignty cannot be sold. If this story makes your heart beat stronger, do not let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe because our history has been muted for too long, and it is time to speak our future out loud. And in the comments, let your voice be heard. New Africa, Africa Rise, or simply, Africa can do it. Because the golden age of freedom has begun, and the world must know it. The story of the Sahel Gold was never just about minerals buried beneath the soil. It was about a people deciding that history had taken enough from them. For centuries, Africa had been treated as a warehouse of raw materials, its people reduced to laborers, its governments trapped in debt. But when Ibrahim Traoré locked that briefcase in Ouagadougou and chose unity over silence, a new chapter opened. From the dusty corridors of the Nuba Mountains to the glittering halls of the United Nations, Africa's message grew louder. We will no longer be plundered. We will no longer sell our children's future for pennies. In the eyes of many, this was the true beginning of anti-colonial Africa, not a political slogan, but an economic revolution. Hospitals rose where there had once been ruins. Universities trained engineers who no longer had to flee abroad for opportunity. Roads cut through deserts, linking villages to markets for the first time. And across the continent, young people began to believe that African development was not a foreign gift, but their birthright. For elders who had lived through the bitterness of colonialism, the sight was overwhelming. They had seen promises broken, leaders assassinated, dreams crushed beneath foreign boots. Yet at last they witnessed Africa not begging for respect but demanding it, not as subjects but as equals. Traore's doctrine was simple: control the wealth, control the destiny. That was the essence of anti-colonial Africa in the 21st century. But this story is not finished. The battles will not end and the temptations of division remain strong. The question now is whether Africa will carry its courage forward or allow old chains to return in new forms. That answer does not belong only to presidents and generals. It belongs to every African who believes that dignity cannot be bought and sovereignty cannot be sold. If this story makes your heart beat stronger, do not let it fade. Like, share, and subscribe because our history has been muted for too long and it is time to speak our future out loud. And in the comments, let your voice be heard. New Africa, Africa Rise, or simply, Africa can do it. Because the golden age of freedom has begun, and the world must know it.